Before you celebrate your new life, first check the signature you used to pay for it. What are you saying, Imani? The documentation for your payment. Look, this is impossible. Where did you get this? Dominic, what is going on? At 12:07 p.m., the marina in Oak Bluffs on Martha's Vineyard looked like a showcase built so no one would remember the cost of humiliation. Under a clear sky, glasses of champagne sparkled among linen suits, designer dresses, and cameras lined up in front of the main dock. At the center of it all, covered by a white tarp, awaited the new yacht of the Vance Hospitality Group, a 157-foot vessel that Dominic Vance had been presenting for months as the definitive venture of his business empire. Imani Bishop arrived without an escort in a dark blue dress, her hair pulled back, and it took her less than a minute to understand that the invitation was not meant to recognize her, but to display her. Her name was not at the head table. There was no chair reserved next to her husband. A visibly flustered event staffer led her to the third row and mumbled that it was a last-minute change ordered by the communications department. From her seat, Imani watched Aaliyah Dubois walk onto the stage on Dominic's arm. The communications director wore an ivory dress that looked too much like what a bride would choose for a courthouse wedding, and greeted the photographers with the confidence of someone who already considered herself the owner of the courthouse wedding place. Dominic, impeccable in a light blue suit, did not look at his wife even once. When he took the microphone, he spoke of the future, of audacity, and of the need to surround oneself with people capable of inspiring great decisions. Then he placed a hand on Aaliyah's waist and added that this project wouldn't have had a soul without her. Some guests looked down, others smiled with a cruel curiosity. Imani felt that the silence of those present was more offensive than any insult, but she kept her hands clasped over her purse. She had learned that in certain circles, losing your composure was to gift the enemy the only victory they did not yet possess. The tarp fell to the ground amid prepared applause, and golden letters appeared on the white hull, Aaliyah. The name took up so much space it seemed like a declaration of war. A murmur rippled through the dock, followed by the frantic clicking of cameras. Dominic smiled as if he had just unveiled a masterpiece, while Aaliyah brought a hand to her chest with carefully rehearsed emotion. Imani did not look away from the boat. Near the gangway, she distinguished a small metal plaque with the financial transactions registration number, the same code she had seen 6 months ago in the Project Aurora documents. That detail confirmed what had until then been a suspicion. There was no second yacht, no parallel investment, no administrative error. The gift offered to the Mistress had been paid for with the debt guaranteed by the building Imani had inherited from her father. Dominic then called Imani up to the stage with a broad smile, pronouncing her name as if bestowing an honor upon her. He assured everyone that his wife had always supported the group's growth and that he wanted to share this moment of corporate unity with her. The invitation was a perfect trap. If Imani refused him, he would portray her as a jealous woman, incapable of separating business from her private life. If she accepted, the photographs would show a wife publicly legitimizing the tribute to the Mistress. Imani stood up, walked between the rows without rushing, feeling dozens of phones following her every step. Upon reaching the stage, Dominic tried to kiss her on the cheek, but she turned her face with such discretion that the gesture was visible only to him. Aaliyah held a bottle of champagne with a gold ribbon and offered her a glass. Imani did not take it. Instead, she looked at the bottle and asked in a calm voice if they had already received the final authorization for the christening. For a moment, Dominic's triumphant expression faltered. He recovered his smile immediately and replied that all the permits were in order, that the group's lawyers had worked for weeks, and that it was not the time to bore the guests with technical details. Aaliyah laughed and brought the bottle closer to the hull, but Imani extended a hand and gently held the ribbon before she could lift it. There was no struggle, no shouting, just a precise gesture that was enough to halt the ceremony. Then Imani uttered the sentence that left the dock motionless. "Before you break that bottle, Aaliyah, you should take a good look at who is paying for the boat that bears your name." The silence was immediate. Dominic approached his wife and, without dropping his smile for the cameras, whispered that she was making a fool of herself. Imani opened her purse, took out a gray folder, and placed it on the lectern. On the cover, one could read the logo of the Heritage Trust Bank and a reference to the financing file for Project Aurora. Aaliyah took half a step back, though she tried to keep her chin up. Dominic slammed the folder shut and announced that his wife was going through a difficult emotional stage caused by her mother's illness and a mistaken interpretation of certain private matters. The cruelty of those words was more private than public. He was using Imani's suffering to discredit her in front of everyone. He then asked the musicians to resume the interrupted piece and ordered the protocol team to continue. No one obeyed. 2 black SUVs had just stopped at the entrance to the dock. From them stepped Mr. Henderson, the director of private banking, a legal advisor, and 3 compliance officers. Behind them walked 2 port security agents. Mr. Henderson did not greet Dominic. He approached the stage, showed his identification, and announced that by order of the financing entity, the final disbursement was suspended, the delivery authorization was revoked, and any attempt to put the vessel into operation was prohibited. The bottle slipped from Aaliyah's hands, but an employee managed to catch it before it hit the ground. The gesture caused a collective sigh, as if the guests had been expecting an explosion. Dominic demanded an explanation, stating that the bank could not cancel an approved and formalized operation. Mr. Henderson replied that the entity could indeed do so when there were reasonable signs of document forgery, concealment of the real beneficiary, and substantial modification of the loan's purpose. Each term fell upon the stage with the coldness of a sentence. At a signal from the legal advisor, the agents closed the gangway and placed a provisional seal on the yacht's main access. The photographers stopped pointing their lenses at Aaliyah and turned them towards Dominic. The man who minutes before was celebrating his power now looked like an accused man. He looked for Imani amidst the confusion and understood too late that her silence in recent weeks had not been resignation but preparation. The members of the board of directors began to A French investor who had traveled from Paris asked to speak immediately with the chief financial officer. The president of a cultural foundation, an old friend of Imani's, approached her and asked in a low voice if she needed to leave through a private exit. Imani shook her head. She had not endured 6 months of deception to leave, just when the truth was beginning to fill the space that lies had once occupied. Dominic ordered the head of press to expel the photographers, but the event contract granted accredited media access until the end of the ceremony, and no one wanted to take responsibility for silencing them. Aaliyah tried to cover the letters of her name with her body, a futile gesture against a 157-foot hull. For the first time, the tribute she had demanded seemed like a mark of shame. Imani watched the scene and remembered the day she had signed the first document, convinced she was protecting the future of her marriage. 6 months earlier, Atlanta was waking up to a persistent rain when Dominic left a blue folder on the breakfast table. Imani had been sleeping barely 4 hours a night for 3 nights because her mother had just had surgery and needed company at the clinic. He waited for the housekeeper to leave the kitchen, served coffee, and adopted that warm voice he used when he wanted something difficult to deny. He explained that Vance Hospitality Group had been invited to participate in an alliance with several resorts in the Caribbean and that they needed a corporate vessel to organize meetings, private dinners, and high-level tourist tours. The project, which they called Aurora, could double the group's value in less than 5 years. Imani listened attentively, although one sentence made her uneasy. The bank required additional collateral, and the board did not want to commit operational assets. Dominic took her hand and said that he only trusted her to save the most important opportunity of their lives. Imani knew the price of that trust. 15 years earlier, when Dominic was running a small event planning company, she had mortgaged an inherited apartment to cover payroll. Later, she introduced her husband to investors who respected the Bishop family name and helped him secure the first hotel in the chain. She never asked for her name to appear in interviews or on inaugural plaques. It was enough for her to believe they were building something together. The building Dominic now intended to offer as collateral was different. An office building in the Cascade Heights neighborhood that her father had left her with a moral, though not legal, condition. He had asked her not to risk it for someone else's pride. Imani remembered his words as she skimmed the contract. The document described the yacht as a business unit, establishing routes, revenue projections, and express restrictions against personal use. Dominic assured her that everything had been reviewed by independent lawyers and that Imani's real exposure would be minimal. "I don't want this boat to become another symbol to feed egos," Imani warned him that morning, closing the folder without yet signing. Dominic smiled and replied that he wasn't planning to buy a toy, but a business tool. He even joked that if he ever tried to christen it with a woman's name, Imani would have permission to sink it before it set sail. The irony would have been unbearable months later. At that moment, she only saw the man with whom she had shared half her life. She asked why the company couldn't wait another year. Dominic answered that competitors were already making moves, and that losing the deal would mean laying off employees. It was a calculated exaggeration because it linked Imani's refusal to the suffering of innocent workers. Finally, she asked for 24 hours to consult her advisor. Dominic agreed, But that same afternoon, he showed up at the clinic with flowers for her mother-in-law and brought with him a simplified version of the agreement prepared to be signed. Imani signed in a waiting room while a nurse called her name to give her the results of one of her mother's tests. Dominic hugged her, promised she would never regret trusting him, and put away the documents with a speed that didn't seem strange to her at the time. During the first few weeks, he shared optimistic reports and photographs from the shipyard. Then he started to respond with evasions. He said the meetings were too technical, that Imani needed to rest, and that there was no point in worrying her with minor changes. When she requested access to the project's digital folder, she discovered that her user no longer had permissions. Dominic attributed the block to a security update. He also stopped talking about Project Aurora during dinners. Instead, he increasingly mentioned Alia Dubois, the new communications director, brilliant, modern, capable of understanding the image the company needed. Imani heard that name with a discomfort she didn't yet know how to justify. Despite the project block, Imani could still review the joint marital account. There, she found fragmented transfers in smaller amounts directed to vendors with generic names. A design company had received private funds, although the original budget indicated that all finishes would be covered by the corporate loan. Another payment was to a jeweler in Buckhead. Imani noted each reference and requested copies of the invoices. 2 days later, an envelope addressed to Dominic arrived by mistake. Inside was a design for the master cabin's plaque. For Alia, the woman who taught me to live without asking for permission. Below was her husband's signature. Imani felt a dry pressure in her chest, but the most painful part was not confirming the infidelity, but discovering that Dominic intended to turn it into a public celebration financed with her own assets. She photographed the document, returned it to the envelope, and left it exactly where she had found it. From that moment on, every smile she offered her husband was a closed door. A week later, she received the official invitation to the christening. The design showed the yacht's profile at sunset and announced the birth of a new era. Alia's name appeared in prominent letters as the project's muse. Imani's name was at the end of the list of institutional guests. Dominic came home after midnight and found her sitting in the living room with the card on her lap. He didn't even try to hide his satisfaction. He told her he expected her to know how to behave, because banks, press, and potential partners would be attending. Imani asked if the boat was still registered as a commercial asset of Vance Hospitality Group. Dominic said yes, though he avoided looking at her. She then asked why it was named after Alia. He smiled with contempt and explained that names did not grant ownership, that they were just marketing tools, and that Imani needed to stop thinking like a wounded wife if she wanted to continue belonging to his world. Imani held his gaze and asked what would happen if she refused to attend. Dominic approached, placed a hand on the back of the armchair, and said that her absence would confirm to everyone that she was no longer up to the life he had built. He added that after the christening, they would talk about a discreet separation, without scandals and with a reasonable compensation. The word compensation revealed the extent to which he had rewritten his own history. He saw himself as the creator of the fortune and Imani as a dependent he could dismiss with elegance. She asked if he also intended to keep her father's building when the loan payments came due. Dominic replied that no collateral would be executed as long as she did not act irrationally. Then he kissed her on the forehead, a gesture of superiority disguised as affection, and went up to the bedroom without noticing that Imani had left her phone recording inside her purse. The next morning, Imani called Anika Jones and requested a meeting outside of Atlanta. She explained nothing over the phone, only that she needed to review a guarantee, several transfers, and an electronic signature that might have been used without authorization. Before leaving, she opened the old corporate email she still had on a tablet and found an automatic notification sent weeks ago. The operational beneficiary of Project Aurora had been modified. The new name was Coastal Dreams Charters, a company established just 3 months ago. Imani looked up its administrators and recognized the last name of Alia's brother. For the first time, all the pieces fit together. The yacht was not intended to represent Vance Hospitality Group. After the christening, it would be ceded to a company linked to his mistress, while the debt and the risk would remain on Imani's assets. She closed the screen, saved the documents in a gray folder, and understood that she should not prevent the ceremony. She should let Dominic get to the stage, convinced that he had already won in Martha's Vineyard. 6 months later, that gray folder remained open on the lectern as the bank sealed the yacht. Dominic was still trying to convince the guests that it was all a temporary misunderstanding, but his voice had lost its authority. Imani looked at the golden letters on the hull and felt not satisfaction, but a deep sadness for the woman she had been when she signed in that hospital room. She had wanted to protect a shared future, and had handed her husband the very instrument he planned to use to erase her. Mr. Henderson asked her to accompany him to formalize her statement, but she requested a few minutes. She approached Aaliyah, who was still clinging to the champagne bottle, and told her in a low voice that the boat had never been a gift of love. It was a debt hidden under shiny paint. Aaliyah looked at Dominic as if seeing him for the first time. Imani descended from the stage while behind her, the accusations began. The christening had been cancelled, but Dominic's real fall had just begun. The morning after the signing at the clinic, Imani woke up with the feeling of having left something important in a room she could no longer open. Dominic had come home late, but before leaving for the office, he left a brief note on the table, thanking her for her trust. Next to it was a box with a pair of diamond earrings that Imani did not remember ever mentioning. She didn't touch them. For years, her husband's gifts had followed a simple logic. The bigger the decision he made without consulting her, the more expensive the object with which he tried to soften it. Still, Imani decided not to feed her doubts. She told herself that the project could save jobs, increase the group's value, and guarantee the stability of hundreds of families. That was the reason she had signed, not Dominic's pressure, nor the guilt he had so skillfully awakened in her. During the first few weeks, Project Aurora seemed to be progressing as promised. Dominic sent photographs of the shipyard, construction reports, and enthusiastic messages about the yacht's commercial possibilities. He spoke of private routes between Martha's Vineyard, the Bahamas, and Turks and Caicos, dinners for investors, and agreements with luxury hotels. Imani even prepared a list of potential international clients. But when she presented it to him, Dominic told her that the sales department had designed a more modern strategy. He didn't reject it outright. He simply left her documents on a piece of furniture and never mentioned them again. Shortly after, Imani discovered that she had been removed from the email group where project updates were distributed. Dominic blamed a system migration and promised that someone would restore her access. No one did. That exclusion did not seem serious on its own, but it added to other small decisions that were slowly pushing her out of a company she had helped build. Aaliyah Dubois appeared in their lives with the naturalness of a person who already knew all the spaces before entering. Dominic introduced her during a charity dinner in Atlanta as the new director of communications, a professional capable of transforming the outdated image of Vance Hospitality Group. Aaliyah shook Imani's hand and told her she deeply admired her discretion, a word that sounded less like a compliment and more like a definition of the place she intended to assign her. During dinner, she sat next to Dominic, corrected some of his answers to the press, and finished his sentences with a familiarity unbecoming of a newly hired employee. Imani noticed that they shared inside jokes about meetings to which she had never been invited. When she asked about Aaliyah's experience in the hospitality sector, Dominic answered for her, stating that talent should not be measured by years, but by the ability to understand the future. In the following months, Aaliyah began to appear in photographs taken inside the shipyard. In one of them, she wore a white hard hat with her initials engraved on it and rested a hand on the yacht's railing, as if inspecting a personal property. In another, Dominic watched her from the background with an expression Imani recognized immediately. It was the same look he had given her when they both had nothing, and any project seemed like a shared promise. When asked why the head of communications was involved in technical decisions, Dominic replied that Aaliyah was coordinating the overall image of the launch. He added that Imani was misinterpreting a professional collaboration because she was spending too much time worried about her mother's health. That reference was not accidental. Every time she expressed a concern, he used fatigue, family illness, or her supposed sensitivity to present any reasonable question as an emotional reaction. Imani tried to focus on the recovery of her mother, Teresa Bishop, who still needed rehabilitation sessions and frequent checkups. Teresa had been a strong woman, accustomed to running businesses alongside her late husband, and she immediately sensed that her daughter was hiding something. One afternoon, she asked if Dominic was having financial problems. Imani replied that it was a major investment and that everything was under control. Teresa remained silent for a few seconds before reminding her that the building in Cascade Heights was not just a profitable property, but the last asset her father had kept outside of the Vance corporate structure. She explained that he had done so because he admired Dominic, but distrusted his need to constantly prove he was the most powerful man in any room. Imani defended her husband, although her words sounded weaker than she expected. Upon leaving the clinic, she understood that she had been justifying what she could not explain for too long. The first concrete irregularity appeared on a statement from their joint account. There was a transfer of $48,000 to a company called Vela Interior Design, registered in Miami. Imani searched for the name in the Project Aurora budgets and found no reference. 2 days later, another payment appeared, this time for $19,000, to a custom textile firm. When she asked Dominic, he replied that they were modifications approved by the design team and that the corporate accounts would be reimbursed later. Imani reminded him that the guarantee contract prohibited using private funds to alter the asset without informing the bank. Dominic became annoyed and said she was confusing accounting formalities with business decisions. He then added that he couldn't halt a multi-million-dollar project for every curtain or glass that was purchased. Imani didn't argue, but she downloaded the bank transactions and began saving them in a password-protected folder. A few days later, a courier delivered an envelope to the house addressed to Dominic. The sender was Vela Interior Design. Imani thought about leaving it in his office unopened, but as she moved it, she saw that the flap was not properly sealed, and a sheet of paper slid to the floor. It was a detailed invoice for the master cabin, light wood panels, embroidered sheets, a custom-designed vanity, and a small refrigerated compartment for cosmetics. In the comments column, it read that all elements should follow the personal preferences of Miss Aaliyah Dubois. Imani felt the air in the room grow heavy. She continued reading and found a second sheet with the design of golden initials, A.D., intended for the towels, the shower glass, and the dressing room door. This did not correspond to a communication strategy. It was the meticulous preparation of an intimate space for her husband's mistress. Imani photographed each page and returned the documents to the envelope. That night, Dominic had dinner at home for the first time in almost a week. He talked about a meeting with Portuguese investors and was particularly attentive, as if he suspected something had changed. Imani asked him if the yacht would have bedrooms assigned to team members. He replied that all rooms would be flexible, adapted for clients and events. When she mentioned that some companies customized cabins for their executives, Dominic laughed and said it would be absurd to turn a commercial vessel into a private home. Imani watched him cut his steak without looking up. She didn't need a confession. The lie was in the precision with which he denied exactly what she had just discovered. Before dinner ended, he received a message and smiled involuntarily. He put the phone away immediately, but Imani managed to see a white heart next to Aaliyah's name. From that moment on, Imani began to review every detail without announcing it. She consulted business registries, looked for suppliers, and compared actual expenses with approved budgets. She discovered that several payments had been fragmented to avoid internal controls, and that some contracts bore the signature of the chief financial officer, although the dates coincided with a trip of his to Singapore. She also found invoices from a jeweler, an event designer, and a company specializing in private celebrations at sea. None of these services were listed in the business proposal presented to the bank. However, Imani still did not have proof that Dominic intended to transfer the use of the yacht to Aaliyah. It could be abusive spending, infidelity, or irresponsible management, but she needed to understand the entire mechanism before acting. She knew that if she confronted him too soon, he would delete emails, change contracts, and use his influence to make her seem unstable. While Imani gathered documents, Dominic intensified his efforts to remove her from the company's decisions. During a family meeting, he announced that the board had approved a restructuring and that to avoid conflicts of interest, Imani would no longer receive operational information as long as her building remained tied as collateral. He presented the measure as a protection for her. In reality, it made her responsible for the risk without allowing her to supervise its origin. When Imani asked to attend the next board meeting as a shareholder, Dominic replied that her presence could be interpreted as undue pressure. Dominic's brother, Marcus, supported the decision and suggested that Imani take care of the family foundation, where her sensitivity would be more useful. No one mentioned that the foundation existed thanks to donations from the Bishop family. Imani accepted the withdrawal without protest. The more secure they felt, the less careful they were when speaking in front of her. Aaliyah took advantage of this absence to occupy an increasingly visible place. She appeared in magazines alongside Dominic, attended private dinners with investors, and began using an office on the executive floor. In an interview, she stated that Vance Hospitality Group needed to free itself from certain family traditions to become an international brand. She didn't mention Imani, but everyone understood the reference. Days later, during the inauguration of a hotel in Savannah, Aaliyah wore a jacket suit that Imani had commissioned months earlier from an Italian designer. Dominic explained it was a coincidence, although the garment was a one-of-a-kind piece. Imani later discovered that her husband had personally picked it up from the studio and given it to Aaliyah. This appropriation of small objects was almost crueler than the infidelity. Aaliyah didn't just want the man, but the external signs of the life Imani had built with him. Her clothes, her contacts, her places, and finally, her assets. One afternoon, Imani received a call from a shipyard employee named Keisha. The woman said she was calling about an administrative matter and asked if Imani had authorized the change of the project's name. According to the original file, the yacht was to be named Aurora, but Dominic's office had requested to replace it with Aaliyah. Keisha needed to confirm who would cover the additional costs for registration and painting. Imani pretended to know about the change and asked for the documentation to be sent to her. The employee hesitated, as she had instructions to communicate only with the management of Vance Hospitality Group, but finally sent a copy of the order. The document bore an electronic signature attributed to Imani and a sentence declaring that she waived any objection to the commercial naming of the vessel. Imani opened her personal files and compared the signature. It was authentic, but it had been extracted from an authorization she had signed 2 years earlier for the renovation of a hotel. That night, Imani waited for Dominic in his study. She placed a printout of the order on the table, but covered the part where the signature appeared. When he arrived, she asked if he planned to change the name Aurora. Dominic calmly took off his jacket and replied that Aaliyah was just one possibility proposed by marketing. Imani pointed out that using an employee's name could create rumors. He approached and said that the rumors already existed because she insisted on behaving like an abandoned wife. Then he added that Aaliyah represented youth, freedom, and ambition, values the brand needed. Imani asked what she represented. Dominic took too long to answer. Finally, he said that Imani represented stability and the past, as if both words were a condemnation. Then he took the document, recognized the order, and assured her that an assistant must have mixed up files. He promised to correct it, but put the paper in a drawer instead of tearing it up. The next day, Imani checked and found that her signature was still linked to the authorization. She also discovered that the document had been sent to the bank as part of a project update. This meant that the financial institution might believe she knew about and accepted the change. For the first time, Imani seriously considered the possibility of withdrawing her collateral. However, doing so without sufficient proof could trigger an early repayment of the debt and harm the company, innocent employees, and suppliers. Dominic had built a trap where any move she made could be used to accuse her of destroying the family assets. Imani needed to distinguish which part of the business was real and which had been designed to benefit Aaliyah. She called the bank and requested a complete copy of the file in her capacity as guarantor. The assistant replied that she had to process the request through Vance Hospitality Group. That response was incorrect, and Imani understood that someone had also altered the communication channels. She then decided to visit the private banking branch in person. Mr. Henderson received her cordially, though he seemed surprised by her presence. Imani said she wanted to review the obligations associated with her guarantee, without mentioning the infidelity or the forged documents. Mr. Henderson opened the file and began to explain the conditions. When he reached the recent updates, he frowned. According to the bank's records, Imani had participated in 2 virtual meetings and approved a change in the operational structure. She asked for the dates. One corresponded to the day of her mother's surgery, the other to a morning when she had attended a foundation hearing in Washington, D.C. Mr. Henderson turned the screen to show her the minutes. There was a statement in which Imani accepted that the yacht be temporarily leased to an external operator. The name of that operator was hidden in an annex that the bank had not yet fully reviewed. Imani showed no surprise. She asked what would happen if the operator was related to a person connected to the project's management. Mr. Henderson explained that the relationship had to be declared, especially if the contract reduced the projected revenues or transferred effective control of the vessel. He added that any concealment could trigger a compliance review. Imani requested certified copies of everything bearing her signature and reminded him that as a guarantor, she had the right to receive them. Mr. Henderson agreed, but before saying goodbye, he asked if he should be worried. Imani replied that she didn't yet know if the bank was facing an administrative error or something more serious. That prudence impressed Mr. Henderson. He gave her his direct number and asked her to call him if she found any discrepancy. Upon leaving the building, Imani carried a heavier folder and a more painful certainty. Dominic wasn't just deceiving her as a husband. He was using her identity as a financial instrument. That same afternoon, she received another unexpected piece of the puzzle. Keisha, the shipyard employee, accidentally sent her an internal schedule for the christening. The program included a private ceremony after the official event, a dinner for 20 guests, and the symbolic delivery of a key to Aaliyah Dubois. In the notes, there was an instruction from Dominic. Ensure Mrs. Bishop does not remain on board after the institutional photographs. Imani read the sentence several times. He intended to use her to legitimize the act before the bank and the press, but then he would expel her from the boat guaranteed with her own assets. She also found the text of Dominic's speech. In it, he spoke of a woman who had taught him to live without fear and to start over. The word wife did not appear once. Imani closed the file and felt something inside her stop waiting for an explanation that could save the marriage. When Dominic returned from a business trip, Imani suggested they have dinner together at the restaurant where they had celebrated their 10th anniversary. She wanted to observe him far from the house, the documents, and the accumulated tension. During dinner, she talked about the early years, the shared sacrifices, and the times they had both promised not to let success turn them into strangers. Dominic listened impatiently, said that people change, and that clinging to the past was a form of cowardice. Imani asked him if he loved another woman. He did not answer directly. He stated that he needed someone capable of moving forward with him, and that Imani had chosen to live among hospitals, family memories, and obligations. That accusation revealed his true logic. Imani's loyalty to her mother was, for him, a weakness, while his own betrayal was presented as personal evolution. Imani finished dinner without crying and paid with the card for the account he was emptying. 2 days later, the definitive invitation to the christening arrived. The envelope was thick, white, and sealed with a golden stamp. On the cover, the word Aaliyah appeared above the silhouette of the yacht. Inside, a paragraph described the director of communications as the inspiration and godmother of the vessel. Imani was listed on a secondary list, along with lawyers, suppliers, and institutional representatives. Dominic found the open invitation and asked if she would attend. She said yes. Her serenity seemed to disappoint him. Perhaps he had expected a scene he could use as justification before others. He warned her that he would not tolerate uncomfortable questions or dramatic behavior. Imani promised she would not interrupt the ceremony without a legitimate reason. Dominic smiled, convinced he had regained control, and told her that after the event, they could talk civilly about the future of their marriage. He didn't know that while he was speaking, Imani was recording every word from the phone hidden in her purse. That night, Imani gathered all the documents on the table of her old study: bank statements, invoices, shipyard orders, minutes with reused signatures, and the certified copies provided by Mr. Henderson. A clear link between Aaliyah and the company that would operate the yacht was still missing. She searched the business registry until she found Coastal Dreams Charters, established with minimal capital 3 months earlier. Its manager was Sean Dubois, Aaliyah's older brother. The business address matched an apartment owned by a close friend of hers. Imani opened the bank annex and found the name of the same company as the external operator. The contract established a ridiculously low annual rent and granted priority use to its managers. Vance Hospitality would pay the debt, maintenance, and crew. Aaliyah and her circle would enjoy the boat. The structure was as simple as it was arrogant. Dominic had trusted that Imani would never look beyond the cover page. Imani printed the business registry and added it to the folder. Then she called Anika Jones. Her friend listened in silence as she explained the guarantee, the signatures, the related company, and the christening plan. When she finished, Anika didn't talk about divorce or infidelity. She said they could be looking at document forgery, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraud against the financial institution. She ordered her not to confront Dominic, not to sign anything else, and to keep copies outside the house. She also asked her to come to her office first thing in the morning. Imani hung up and stood by the window, contemplating the lights of Atlanta. For the first time since discovering Aaliyah's name on the invoices, she didn't just feel betrayed. She felt dangerous to those who had mistaken her trust for ignorance. Dominic still had the stage, the press, and the boat. Imani was beginning to have the truth. Anika Jones's office occupied the top floor of a discreet building facing Piedmont Park, far from the hotels, restaurants, and offices where the Vance name opened doors before anyone asked the reason for the visit. Imani arrived at 8 inches the morning with 2 folders, an external drive, and the invitation to the christening stored inside a transparent sleeve. Anika greeted her without a hug, until the door was closed. Then she held her friend's shoulders and asked if she was prepared to know a truth that might make any reconciliation impossible. Imani replied that reconciliation had stopped mattering to her when she discovered her husband had used her signature. What she needed to know was how much damage Dominic could cause before she could stop him. Anika spread the documents on a table and separated the evidence of adultery from the financial evidence. One could destroy a marriage, the other could destroy a company, and bring several people before a judge. For nearly 3 hours, Anika reconstructed the operation as if dismantling a machine designed to work only as long as no one looked inside. The loan had been granted to Vance Hospitality to acquire a commercial asset. Imani provided the strongest guarantee, but was not listed as a project administrator. Months later, through annexes sent without her knowledge, the yacht had been assigned to an operating company related to Aaliyah. Vance Hospitality would retain the debt, insurance, maintenance, and crew salaries, while Coastal Dreams Charters would pay an annual amount lower than the cost of docking. Anika underlined a clause that allowed the operator to use the vessel for 220 days a year. This was not a commercial collaboration but a disguised transfer. Dominic intended to turn his wife's assets into a permanent source of luxury for his mistress, and had used business language to conceal something as basic as a gift paid for by someone else. Anika called Jamal Cole, a forensic IT expert she had worked with on corporate fraud investigations. Jamal arrived before noon and examined the digital versions of the documents attributed to Imani. He didn't need much time to detect the first irregularity. The signature inserted in the modification minutes had not been generated during the supposed virtual meeting. It came from a file created 2 years earlier to authorize the renovation of a hotel in Miami. The cutout retained metadata from the original document and small compression marks that did not match the rest of the page. Furthermore, the electronic certificate associated with Imani had never validated the operation. Someone had placed an image of her signature and then converted the file into a non-editable PDF. Jamal explained that the deception might seem convincing at first glance, but would not withstand a forensic analysis. Imani looked at her own name at the bottom of the document and felt the strange impression of seeing a stranger used to commit a crime. The second finding was even more serious. The bank's minutes claimed that Imani had participated in 2 video conferences, but the access logs showed connections made from the IP address of Dominic's private office. In one of the meetings, Imani's user had remained connected for just 4 minutes and had not activated the camera or microphone. Still, the project secretary had written that the guarantor expressed her agreement and answered several questions. Regarding the external operator, Jamal traced the device used and found that it belonged to a corporate tablet assigned to Brianna Scott, Dominic's personal assistant. Anika noted the name. Imani had known Brianna for years, a reserved woman who organized trips, meetings, and gifts without ever asking who they were for. She didn't know if she had participated voluntarily or if her boss had used her device. Before accusing her, they needed to recover the original emails and find out who had drafted the false minutes. Through the business registry, Anika obtained the complete deed for Coastal Dreams Charters. Sean Dubois, Aaliyah's brother, was listed as the sole administrator, but the initial capital had been transferred from an account belonging to a consulting firm that worked exclusively for Vance Hospitality. The company had no employees, previous vessels, or a definitive operating license. Its only documented activity was negotiating the use of Project Aurora. There was also a private option through which Aaliyah could acquire 70% of the shares for $1 once the first sailing season was completed. Dominic's signature appeared as a witness to the agreement. Imani read that clause twice. Her husband not only intended to offer the boat to his mistress for a few months, he was building a structure so that she would end up controlling it without assuming the debt. Anika photographed each page and said that the private option proved who the real beneficiary was, exactly the information Dominic was obligated to disclose to the bank. Keisha, the shipyard administrator who had contacted Imani, agreed to meet them that afternoon in a coffee shop far from the marina. She arrived nervous, looking towards the door several times, and asked that her name not be mentioned unless it was absolutely necessary. She explained that the orders related to the yacht had changed since Aaliyah's arrival. At first, all cabins were designed for corporate guests. Then, the master cabin was converted into a private suite with closets adapted to the measurements of a specific woman. Aaliyah had visited the shipyard on 6 occasions, always accompanied by Dominic, and both referred to the boat as our home on the sea. Keisha also had an email ordering the removal of the Vance Hospitality logo from several interior areas to be replaced by the initials AD. The instruction concluded with a warning. Imani Bishop should not receive copies of the changes because she is only listed as a guarantor and not as part of the creative team. Keisha provided a copy of the visitor log and a voice recording sent by Aaliyah to the supplier group. In it, the director of communications complained that the color of the wood did not match her jewelry and demanded that everything be finished before her birthday. She didn't mention a campaign or a business strategy. She spoke like an owner. However, the most important piece of evidence was an order signed by Dominic, authorizing Coastal Dreams Charters to select the crew and manage private bookings after the christening. The date was before the bank's formal approval of the operator. Anika explained that this demonstrated a prior intention to conceal the asset's real destination. Keisha confessed that she had started to suspect when an engineer asked who would pay for the modifications and received the response that Imani Bishop would end up covering it because her building was worth more than the boat itself. The sentence had been spoken by Sean Dubois in front of several workers. Upon returning to the office, Imani remained silent for a few minutes. Each new piece of evidence confirmed something she already knew emotionally, but turning betrayal into dates, emails, and amounts was more painful than imagining it. Dominic had planned her replacement with patience. While she was taking care of her mother, he was building a new life using the resources of the old one. Anika reminded her that the blame did not belong to the one who had trusted, but to the one who turned that trust into a tool of abuse. Imani replied that she had ignored too many signs because she was afraid to accept that the man she had helped rise saw her as an obstacle. Anika closed the folder and told her they still needed to make a decision. They could immediately report everything to the bank, trigger an audit, and stop the project. Or they could give Dominic one last chance to explain the discrepancies. Imani chose the second option, not because she expected a sincere confession, but because she wanted to hear how far he was willing to lie when he believed she had no proof. Before returning home, Imani called Dominic and asked for a private conversation that night. He replied that he had a work dinner, but agreed when she mentioned the possibility of releasing an additional part of her assets to strengthen the loan. Greed accomplished what the marriage no longer could. At 9 p.m., Dominic entered the villa's library and found Imani by the fireplace with a closed folder on the table. She had hidden a small recording device among several books, although she also had her phone in her purse as a backup. She did not intend to provoke him or obtain a confession through deception. She just wanted to preserve his exact answers. She began by asking if Project Aurora still had the same commercial purpose described in the initial contract. Dominic answered yes, without hesitation. He claimed that no relevant modification had occurred, and that all subsequent decisions were simple marketing adjustments. Imani then asked who Coastal Dreams Charters was. Dominic took a few seconds to respond, but quickly regained his usual tone. He said it was an independent operator with international experience selected to maximize the yacht's profitability. Imani pointed out that the company had been established 3 months ago, and that its administrator was Aaliyah's brother. Dominic frowned, annoyed not by the discovered relationship, but by the fact that his wife had dared to investigate it. He explained that Sean Dubois knew the luxury market, and that family ties did not invalidate a business opportunity. When Imani asked why the rent was lower than the maintenance cost, he assured her it would be compensated through promotion, contacts, and visibility. She asked to see the studies that justified that valuation. Dominic got up, walked to the window, and said he had no intention of submitting every professional decision to the interrogation of a woman who had been away from real management for years. The library door opened before Imani could respond. Aaliyah appeared with a glass of wine in her hand, dressed in a silk shirt belonging to Dominic. She did not seem surprised to find the wife in her own home. On the contrary, she smiled with the confidence of someone who had heard a good part of the conversation from the adjoining office. On her wrist shone an emerald bracelet that Imani recognized immediately. Dominic had given it to her for their 20th anniversary, saying it belonged to their shared history. Imani had stored it months ago in the bedroom safe. Aaliyah raised her glass and commented that financial meetings were always exhausting. Dominic did not ask her to leave. Imani understood that this appearance was not an accident but a deliberate demonstration. They wanted her to see how much ground she had lost and to accept that any resistance would only prolong an inevitable defeat. Imani looked at the bracelet but decided not to ask how it had ended up on Aaliyah's wrist. There were more important matters than a piece of jewelry, although the object summarized how they both understood her life. Everything could be taken, used, and presented as new. She asked Dominic if Aaliyah was the real beneficiary of the yacht. He replied that the boat belonged to Vance Hospitality and that his wife was mixing personal insecurities with corporate structures she did not understand. Aaliyah added that Imani should be proud that her guarantee was allowing them to create something beautiful, instead of behaving like a resentful accountant. Imani looked at the mistress's face and asked if she knew the risk that hung over the building inherited from her father. Aaliyah took a sip of wine and replied that rich people always exaggerated the sentimental value of their properties when they feared losing control. That sentence confirmed that she knew perfectly well where the guarantee came from. Dominic approached Imani and spoke with a calmness more threatening than a shout. He told her that the building would remain safe as long as she did not cause problems with the bank. If she tried to withdraw the guarantee, she could trigger a liquidity crisis, harm the employees, and destroy the value of her own shares. Then he presented the trap as a moral choice. She had to trust him or bear the responsibility of ruining hundreds of families. Imani asked if that meant she could no longer review the project, despite being the one who assumed the greatest risk. Dominic replied that she had signed voluntarily and that the signature did not give her the right to interfere in its direction. He asserted that all decisions were exclusively his, that Aaliyah acted under his orders, and that Imani had no authority to stop the christening. She asked him to repeat it. He did so, more slowly, convinced he was imposing the definitive limits of his power. Aaliyah left her glass on the table and announced that she hoped Imani would attend the ceremony with dignity. She said the press already knew about the separation rumors and that an emotional scene would only confirm that Dominic needed a more stable woman by his side. Imani asked if the boat's name could still be changed. Aaliyah laughed and replied that the golden letters were already installed, the invitation sent, and the speech prepared. She added that some things, once shown in public, could not be taken back. Dominic remained silent, allowing his mistress to humiliate the woman who had guaranteed the operation. Imani closed the folder without revealing the documents, stood up, picked up her purse, and said she would attend. Before leaving, she looked at Dominic and asked if he wished to correct any of his answers. He stated that he had nothing to correct and reminded her that the future belonged to those who dared to take it. When Imani closed the library door, her legs trembled for the first time. She walked to the garden and stood in the darkness until she caught her breath. She wasn't crying for Aaliyah or the bracelet, but for the man who had just turned the economic security of his employees into a threat against his own wife. She had hoped to find a part of Dominic capable of recognizing a limit, but she had only discovered an absolute confidence in his impunity. She retrieved the hidden device when they both went up to the master bedroom. Then she left the villa with a small suitcase and drove to her mother's apartment. On the way, she listened to the recording. Dominic's voice declared that all decisions were his, that Imani had no authority, and that Aaliyah acted on his orders. Those words, meant to diminish her, had just become one of the most useful pieces of evidence to separate her from the committed irregularities. First thing in the morning, Annika received the recording and asked Jamal to verify its integrity. Although a conversation recorded by one of its participants could be admissible under certain circumstances, they preferred not to rely solely on it. They would use it as support to demonstrate Dominic's knowledge and intent. Annika drafted 3 documents. The first revoked Imani's consent for any modification of the loan's purpose. The second notified the bank that several authorizations had been issued through a non-consensual reproduction of her signature. The third requested the immediate activation of internal fraud and real beneficiary protocols. Imani read each page carefully. When she reached the space reserved for her signature, she remembered the hospital room and the confidence with which she had signed months ago. This time, there was no husband holding her hand, no promise of a future. There was only her name, her will, and the decision to protect what she could still save. Mr. Henderson received them in a private room at the bank. His expression changed as he reviewed the deed of Coastal Dreams charters, the signature metadata, and the minutes of non-existent meetings. He asked if Imani was willing to formally declare that she had never approved the yacht's transfer. She said yes and explained that she was even unaware of the operator's existence until a few days ago. Mr. Henderson called the compliance director and asked to suspend any pending disbursement. However, there was a difficulty. Much of the loan had already been transferred to the shipyard, and a hasty cancellation could lead to litigation and alert Dominic before all documentation was secured. The bank needed to review internal files, interview employees, and confirm there were no collaborators within the entity. Mr. Henderson promised to act quickly, but warned that the procedure had to be discreet. If Dominic suspected anything, he could destroy evidence or accelerate the yacht's delivery. Imani asked if the christening could be legally prevented. Mr. Henderson explained that the symbolic ceremony was not the main problem. The decisive thing was to prevent the technical delivery, the final registration, and the last disbursement. As long as the yacht remained under the shipyard's control, the bank retained the ability to intervene. Anika also proposed seeking an injunction from a civil court to prevent the transfer to Coastal Dreams charters and block any modification of the guarantees. They prepared an urgent lawsuit accompanied by forensic reports and Imani's statements. Keisha agreed to provide her emails if she received protection from labor retaliation. Jamal certified the origin of the reused signatures. Mr. Henderson initiated an internal review without communicating it to the usual Vance hospitality team. Each piece began to move in silence, while Dominic continued to organize the party with the certainty that no important person would dare to challenge him in public. 2 days later, Anika called Imani to inform her that the court had accepted the request, but had not yet resolved all the measures. The bank, on the other hand, already considered the discrepancies serious enough to prepare a provisional suspension. Mr. Henderson wanted to act before the delivery, although he recommended waiting until Dominic publicly confirmed the personal use of the yacht. His speech, the presentation of Aaliyah as an inspiration, and any announcement about the transfer could prove that the real destination was never commercial. Imani understood the irony. The ceremony designed to humiliate her could become the stage where Dominic provided the missing evidence against himself. Anika asked if she would be able to attend. She didn't have to. They could stop the operation without exposing her to the cameras. Imani replied that she would be there, not to get revenge on Aaliyah, but to prevent Dominic from later claiming that everything had happened without her knowledge. During the following days, Imani settled into her mother's apartment and maintained a seemingly normal routine. She visited the clinic, answered emails from the foundation, and did not speak to the press. Dominic sent her several messages reminding her of the ceremony's protocol, the recommended dress color, and the obligation to smile during the photographs. He also asked her not to mention financial matters to the investors. Imani replied only that she understood. Meanwhile, Anika coordinated with the bank the exact moment of the intervention. Mr. Henderson would have representatives ready near the marina and would act before the bottle hit the hull. The seal would not be placed due to a marital dispute, but due to a documented fraud investigation. Imani insisted that no information be leaked beforehand. She wanted to prevent Dominic from canceling the event, hiding the yacht, or blaming innocent employees. His downfall had to be a direct consequence of his own decisions, not a rumor. The eve of the christening, Imani opened the safe in her mother's apartment and stored copies of all the evidence inside. Then she looked at the empty space where the emerald bracelet Aaliyah wore in the library should have been. For years, she had confused objects with memories, as if a jewel could preserve the promise with which it had been given. Now she knew that symbols were only worth what the conduct of those who offered them was worth. She placed the invitation on the table and ran a finger over Aaliyah's golden name. She felt no hatred for those letters. The real problem was not that a mistress received a tribute, but that a man had mortgaged his wife's history to finance it. Imani turned off the light and decided she would not make speeches or reveal more than necessary. A question, a gray folder, and the arrival of the bank at the precise moment would be enough. The sound of the cameras became deafening as port security agents closed the yacht's gangway. Mr. Henderson stood before the lectern with a black folder under his arm, while the bank's legal advisor read the suspension notice aloud. Dominic tried to snatch the document from him, but one of the agents intervened without touching him and reminded him that the vessel was still in the shipyard's custody. Guests began to leave their seats to get closer to the stage, and protocol staff formed a useless barrier. In front of dozens of raised phones, Imani watched the chaos from one end of the platform. Just a few minutes before, she was the wife relegated to the third row. Now, everyone was waiting for her to explain why the bank had just stopped the most important ceremony for Vance hospitality. However, Imani did not speak. She knew that any word spoken too soon would allow Dominic to turn a financial investigation into a marital dispute. "This is a maneuver by my wife," Dominic shouted, pointing at Imani in front of the photographers. "She's using her contacts to punish me for a separation she hasn't been able to accept." His voice momentarily regained the force he used in board meetings, and several guests stood motionless, waiting for her response. Aaliyah stood by his side and took the microphone. With teary eyes, she declared that she did not wish to cause pain to anyone and that the yacht's name was a publicity decision, not proof of an illicit relationship. She claimed that Imani had been threatening to destroy the company for months if Dominic didn't come back home. The accusation was carefully prepared. It turned the deceived woman into the aggressor and the lovers into victims of revenge. Imani let them finish. Then she approached the microphone and calmly asked if Coastal Dreams charters belonged to Aaliyah's brother. The question immediately changed both of their expressions. Dominic replied that the company was an independent operator and that the identity of its shareholders was unrelated to the christening. Imani asked again, this time looking directly at Aaliyah, if her brother, Sean Dubois, was the sole administrator of the company that would receive use of the yacht for more than 200 days a year. Aaliyah opened her mouth but couldn't find a confident answer. Dominic intervened, saying that operating contracts were confidential and that his wife was revealing corporate information to cause reputational damage. Anika Jones then appeared from among the guests and walked onto the stage with a certified copy of the business deed. She introduced herself as Imani's legal representative and confirmed that Sean Dubois was listed as the company's administrator. She also explained that a private option existed through which Aaliyah could acquire the majority of the shares for $1. The murmurs turned into exclamations. This no longer looked like simple infidelity, but an operation designed to transfer an asset financed by third parties. Mr. Henderson asked for a series of documents to be projected onto the screen used for the yacht's presentation. The technician hesitated, looking at Dominic, but the legal advisor reminded him that the audiovisual equipment had been hired by the shipyard and he had to cooperate with the inspection. The first image showed the original proposal for Project Aurora, a commercial vessel owned by Vance Hospitality, intended for meetings, corporate routes, and client events. Then, the contract with Coastal Dreams Charters appeared. The difference was obvious, even to those who didn't understand finance. Aaliyah's company would pay a symbolic rent while Dominic's group would cover insurance, maintenance, salaries, fuel, and debt. A board member asked aloud why no one had presented this agreement to the board. Marcus Vance, Dominic's brother, claimed he thought it was a non-binding draft. Anika then showed Dominic's signature at the end of the document and a subsequent order authorizing the operator to hire crew and book private dates before the bank's approval. Dominic tried to stop the projection, claiming the documents were stolen and manipulated. Jamal Cole, the forensic IT expert, identified himself from the front row and stated that he had verified the original files, their metadata, and their sending routes. He explained that several authorizations attributed to Imani contained images of signatures extracted from old documents. An enlarged comparison appeared on the screen between the signature on the Project Aurora minutes and the one Imani had used 2 years ago to renovate a hotel in Miami. The small compression marks matched exactly. Then, the logs of the supposed video conferences where Imani had given her approval were shown. The connections came from Dominic's private office and a tablet assigned to his assistant. Imani was at a clinic during the first meeting and in Washington, D.C. during the second. Anika presented medical receipts and access records from the foundation event. Imani had not been present at either meeting, despite the minutes recording complete answers under her name. A journalist asked Imani if she was publicly accusing her husband of forging her signature. She replied that she didn't need to make accusations in front of the cameras because she had submitted the evidence to the bank and the competent authorities. She added that her goal was not to humiliate Dominic, but to prevent a debt guaranteed with her assets from being used to benefit people who had never assumed the risk. Her calm tone contrasted with the agitation on stage. Dominic approached her and demanded she admit that she had authorized the loan. Imani confirmed that she had, but reminded him that her consent was tied to a specific commercial project. She had not approved a transfer to Aaliyah's family, nor the use of her signature in non-existent meetings. Then she looked at the golden name on the hull and declared that the boat was not a symbol of love. It was the visible proof that someone had mistaken a wife's trust for a blank check. Aaliyah took the microphone again and said she had never participated in financial decisions. She claimed that Dominic had explained to her that the vessel belonged to the group, that the contract with her brother was legal, and that the name change was part of an international campaign. As she spoke, her voice began to lose its confidence. Anika requested that an email sent by Aaliyah to Sean Dubois be projected. In it, the communications director celebrated that once the final disbursement was complete, Imani can no longer stop us from using the boat. She also recommended keeping her out of meetings because she might ask questions about the guarantee. Aaliyah claimed the sentences were taken out of context. The next image showed a transcribed voice message in which she demanded her cabin be finished before her birthday and asked to remove the Vance Hospitality logo from the private areas. The guests who had previously toasted her began to move away. The woman honored on the hull no longer seemed like a muse, but a conscious beneficiary of the deceit. Dominic turned to Aaliyah with restrained fury and asked her why she had written those messages. She replied that she was only repeating what he had told her. The argument unfolded in front of the still-open microphones. Aaliyah claimed Dominic had assured her that Imani would sign anything, and that her building would cover all the risks. He accused her of distorting private conversations. She retorted that she had agreed to participate because he promised her a quick separation and control of the yacht after the first season. The audience fell silent, understanding that the alliance was beginning to crumble. Imani didn't need to intervene. They were each trying to save themselves by sacrificing the other. Marcus Vance asked the technicians to cut the sound, but the journalists had already recorded enough. Mr. Henderson reminded them that any statement could be incorporated into the bank's internal investigation. Dominic accused him of organizing a spectacle, and Mr. Henderson replied that the spectacle had been organized by the CEO himself when he turned a credit operation into a personal ceremony. The board members held an emergency meeting in one of the marina's lounges. Dominic wanted to enter, accompanied by Aaliyah, but the board secretary informed him that she had no right to participate. For the first time since her hiring, Aaliyah was left outside a door that her relationship with the CEO could not open. Imani was invited as a shareholder and primary guarantor, though she asked that Anika remain by her side. Inside, the chief financial officer declared that he was unaware of the final contract with Coastal Dreams Charters. He admitted to authorizing some payments, but claimed the orders came directly from Dominic and were accompanied by supposed approvals from Imani. Other board members acknowledged receiving incomplete reports. Marcus tried to defend his brother, saying that administrative errors did not justify destroying the group's reputation. Imani placed the record of transfers from the joint account on the table and asked if he also considered it an error to use private funds to decorate Aaliyah's cabin. No one answered. Dominic argued that Imani had historically consented to supporting the group's projects and that her delayed intervention constituted an abuse of power. Anika pointed out that a guarantee did not authorize the borrower to change the real beneficiary, forge meetings, or use common assets for personal purposes. The independent chairman of the board asked Dominic if he had informed anyone about the option that would allow Aaliyah to acquire Coastal Dreams Charters. He said it was a preliminary proposal. Anika showed the signed and dated copy. Then she played the recording from the library where Dominic clearly stated that all decisions were exclusively his, that Aaliyah acted following his orders, and that Imani had no authority to intervene. The sentence he had uttered to diminish his wife became the evidence that prevented him from attributing responsibility to her. Several board members exchanged glances. The chairman called for an immediate vote to temporarily suspend Dominic as CEO while the investigations were ongoing. The result was overwhelming. Only Marcus voted against it. Dominic lost the position he had used for years as an extension of his identity and was forced to hand over his credentials, corporate devices, and access to the group's accounts. When the secretary removed the executive card from the table, he looked at Imani with silent hatred. He asked if she was satisfied after destroying what they had both built. Imani replied that she had not destroyed the company but had prevented him from continuing to use it as personal property. She reminded him that hundreds of employees depended on Vance Hospitality surviving his decisions. The board appointed an interim CEO and authorized a full audit. It also ordered the suspension of any contract related to Aaliyah and Sean Dubois. Dominic wanted to leave the room, but Mr. Henderson informed him that he had to remain available to sign the receipt of the bank notifications. The man who an hour earlier controlled the stage now needed permission even to take his own briefcase. Outside the lounge, Aaliyah waited, surrounded by journalists. Seeing Dominic, she ran to him and demanded he fix the situation. She asked where they would sleep that night and what would happen to the Miami condo, the trips, and the payments he had promised. Dominic replied that it was not the time to talk about amenities. Aaliyah then understood that her cards could be blocked and that none of the luxuries offered were actually in her name. She accused him of using her as the visible face of a plan he had designed. Dominic retorted that she had been the one who insisted on putting her name on the boat and organizing a public ceremony. The argument became more aggressive, though neither raised a hand. They attacked each other with words, memories, and broken promises while the guests watched from a safe distance. Imani walked past them without stopping. Aaliyah called her a coward and claimed she had waited until the last moment to destroy them. Imani turned and said she had given them several opportunities to tell the truth. They had used each one to lie better. Dominic caught up with Imani near the exit of the marina and asked for 5 minutes without lawyers or cameras. Anika objected, but Imani agreed to talk in a glass-walled office from which they could both be seen. When the door closed, Dominic abandoned his tone of authority for the first time. He said he could fix everything. They would remove Aaliyah's name, cancel the contract with Coastal Dreams Charters, and return the private expenses. He assured her that his relationship with her was over, and that they could both present the situation as a management error. Imani listened without interrupting. Dominic reminded her of the difficult years, the first office, the nights without money, and the promises they had shared. He asked her to withdraw the revocation of the guarantee to avoid the sale of the boat. According to him, if she helped him one more time, the company would keep the asset, and their marriage could get a second chance. Imani understood that even his apology contained a financial request. "Do you still think the problem is the boat?" Imani said without raising her voice. "Do you think it's enough to erase a name, change some contracts, and promise me that woman will disappear? The problem is that you used my signature when I was taking care of my mother. You pushed me out of the project, turned my questions into symptoms of jealousy, and set up a debt so someone else could enjoy what I was risking." Dominic looked down but replied that he never thought the building could be lost. Imani asked him why he needed to hide the operation from her then. He said he feared her reaction and that Aaliyah had pressured him to make the relationship public. With each explanation, the responsibility shifted. The market, the bank, the mistress, the wife, never him. Imani stated that trust could not be rebuilt with a man who was still looking for someone to blame. She informed him that she would proceed with the divorce and legally protect her assets. Dominic placed both hands on the table and asked if she wanted to see him in prison. Imani replied that she did not wish to decide his punishment. It would be the bank, the shareholders, and the courts who would determine the consequences of his actions. He insisted that she could soften her statement and present the signatures as a misunderstanding between departments. In return, he was willing to cede her the presidency of the foundation, several properties, and a larger stake in the company. Imani smiled sadly. For years, she had renounced recognition to protect her marriage. Now he was trying to buy her silence with a part of what already belonged to her. She told him she would not negotiate the truth. Before leaving, Dominic uttered the last threat he still had. If he fell, the Vance name would drag hers down too. Imani replied that her dignity had never depended on her husband's last name. She opened the door and let Anika enter to continue any conversation through formal channels. On the dock, shipyard employees began to remove the flowers, ribbons, and tables from the ceremony. The champagne remained unopened in boxes covered by tablecloths. A worker disconnected the luminous sign that announced the christening, and the golden letters of the name Aaliyah lost their shine in the afternoon shadow. Mr. Henderson informed Imani that the bank had frozen the final disbursement and triggered the conditional maturity of the loan. The vessel could not leave the shipyard, be registered in the group's favor, or be transferred to the external operator. They would also report the irregularities to the financial supervisor and the prosecutor's office if the review confirmed the document forgery. Imani asked about the workers and suppliers. Mr. Henderson assured her that the board could negotiate a restructuring to protect the business activity, as long as the company cooperated. That was important to her. She didn't want hundreds of people to pay for Dominic's arrogance, but she also wouldn't accept their jobs being used again to blackmail her. Aaliyah tried to leave in the car that had brought her to the event, but the driver informed her that it belonged to Vance Hospitality and he had received instructions to return it to headquarters. She had to call a taxi while several photographers captured the scene. Before getting in, she looked one last time at the yacht. The name she had demanded as proof of triumph had become an impossible piece of evidence to hide. Sean Dubois called her repeatedly, alarmed by the contract suspension and the possibility of his accounts being investigated. Aaliyah rejected the first calls but finally answered and ordered him to destroy old messages. She didn't know that the order was overheard by a nearby journalist, nor that the bank had already requested to preserve all information related to Coastal Dreams charters. Desperation was beginning to produce new mistakes. Dominic, meanwhile, left the building accompanied by Marcus. Neither of them spoke to her. The love story that was supposed to inaugurate a new life had not survived even an hour without money, power, and protection. Imani remained at the marina until the last guest had left. Anika suggested they return to Atlanta, but she asked to walk for a few minutes along the dock. The sea was calm and reflected the motionless hull of the yacht. There was no music, applause, or speeches, only the sound of ropes straining against their moorings. Imani thought of the morning at the clinic, of Dominic's hand on hers, and the promise that she would never regret having trusted him. For weeks, she had wondered if she should have been more suspicious, tougher, or more vigilant. Now she understood that loving someone was not a mistake. The mistake belonged to the one who had considered that love an exploitable weakness. Anika approached and informed her that the court had just granted precautionary measures to prevent any movement on her father's building and the main joint accounts. For the first time since the beginning of Project Aurora, Imani knew that her home could no longer be used against her. Before leaving the marina, Imani stopped in front of the sealed gangway. A photographer who was still there asked her what she felt seeing the christening of the boat, named after her husband's Mistress, cancelled. She replied that the cancellation was not a personal victory, because no woman should need to lose so many years of trust to regain control of her own life. She added that the real failure was not that the yacht remained at the dock, but that someone had believed that money and power could erase the person who had made his rise possible. Then she left without posing. Behind her, the wind moved the security tape placed over the entrance. The boat was still there, enormous, shiny, and completely useless. Dominic had wanted to use it to announce to the world that Imani belonged to the past. At the end of that day, it was he who had lost his position, his mistress, his access to money, and the future he thought he had secured. 3 weeks after the cancelled christening, Dominic Vance's name had disappeared from the main entrance of the group's headquarters. The bronze plaque was removed before dawn to avoid another gathering of journalists, but several employees paused in front of the empty space upon arriving at work. For years, Dominic had presented the company as an extension of his will. Now, an independent commission was reviewing every contract signed under his direction. While the new CEO sent daily reports to shareholders and the bank, Vance Hospitality continued to operate, albeit with considerable debt and a damaged reputation. Imani attended the meetings as the main shareholder, accompanied by Anika, but she refused to immediately take over the presidency. She didn't want anyone to say she had caused her husband's downfall to take his place. Her priority was to protect jobs, separate legitimate assets from personal operations, and prove that the company could survive without depending on a single man. The audit confirmed that the expenses related to the yacht far exceeded the known figures. Dominic had used joint funds to pay for the private decoration, Aaliyah's trips, a collection of jewelry, and several advances given to Coastal Dreams charters. He had also ordered numerous weekend getaways to be classified as investor meetings. The auditors located emails in which he asked his employees to fragment payments to avoid internal controls. Brianna Scott, his assistant, agreed to testify after learning that Dominic was trying to blame her for the use of the tablet from which Imani's meetings were falsified. Brianna confessed that he had asked her to open the links with his wife's user and keep the connection for a few minutes. He assured her that Imani was aware and that it was just a formality. The woman provided messages, calendars, and recordings of instructions. Her testimony helped prove that the manipulation had not been an improvised mistake but planned conduct. The bank definitively rescinded the financing and demanded that the shipyard take back the vessel. As Vance Hospitality could not cover the outstanding balance without compromising its hotels, the board agreed to relinquish the yacht in exchange for limiting the losses. On a gray morning, several workers began to remove the golden letters from the hull. Aaliyah was not present, but the images circulated through all media outlets. Each letter was unscrewed and placed on a tarp until only a color difference remained on the white paint. The yacht would be sold to a Norwegian businessman and registered under another name. Imani observed the process through a photographic report sent by the shipyard. She felt no joy. That boat had consumed money, trust, and years of a shared life. However, seeing Aaliyah's name disappear, she understood that no symbol of power was permanent. Everything that had seemed unquestionable could be removed with simple tools when the truth changed hands. Sean Dubois tried to dissolve Coastal Dreams charters before the investigation concluded, but the authorities froze his accounts and preserved his records. Aaliyah was summoned to testify about the purchase option, the messages sent to suppliers, and her knowledge of Imani's guarantee. At first, she maintained that Dominic had hidden all the financial details. The strategy weakened when her emails appeared, talking about the Cascade Heights building and the need to complete the christening before Imani could withdraw her support. Her lawyer advised her to cooperate. Aaliyah agreed to acknowledge that she knew the general structure of the agreement, though she tried to present her participation as a consequence of Dominic's promises. She lost her job, the company-paid apartment, and access to the circles where she was once received as the future Mrs. Vance. The same magazines that had featured her dresses began to analyze how much of other people's money had financed each photograph. Dominic remained in the marital villa for weeks until the court ordered him to leave it provisionally. The property had been acquired with funds from both, but the injunction granted Imani exclusive use while the divorce proceeded. He moved into an apartment belonging to Marcus, taking only a few suitcases and several boxes of documents that the lawyers reviewed before allowing him to leave. His corporate cards were canceled, his personal accounts partially frozen, and his business stake subject to potential liabilities. Former partners stopped answering his calls. Some had toasted him in Martha's Vineyard. Now they feared being mentioned in any conversation related to the fraud. Marcus continued to defend him publicly, but privately reproached him for risking the family fortune for a relationship. Dominic replied that everyone had benefited from his ambition while it produced profits. It was true, but not enough. Shared success could not turn deceit into an acceptable decision. The divorce process began without public scenes. Imani requested the separation of assets, the return of funds withdrawn from the common accounts, and the recognition of obligations created without her consent. She did not ask to keep everything, nor did she try to prevent Dominic from keeping what was legitimately his. Anika explained that this moderation might surprise those who expected revenge. Imani replied that she did not want to build her new life around her husband's punishment. She wanted to reclaim what was hers, repair the damage, and close a relationship that could no longer offer her security. During the first hearing, Dominic avoided looking at her until the judge asked if there was any possibility of reconciliation. Then he raised his head and said he still loved his wife. Imani felt an old pang, not because she believed his words, but because she remembered how many times she had hoped to hear them before everything fell apart. She replied that love without respect could not serve as a foundation to remain married. Teresa Bishop received the news of the divorce with a quiet sadness. She had loved Dominic like a son and for years had defended his mistakes to the rest of the family. When Imani told her what had happened with the signature, Alia's company, and the guarantee, Teresa apologized for not having warned her daughter more clearly. Imani sat by her bed and told her that no one could protect an adult woman from every betrayal. Her mother reminded her of her father's words about the building. She should not risk it to feed someone else's pride. Imani acknowledged that she had confused supporting her husband with assuming all the consequences of his decisions. Teresa took her hand and stated that trusting did not make her guilty. The weakness was not in having loved, but in needing to destroy the one you loved to feel powerful. That conversation helped Imani more than any court resolution. 2 months later, Dominic asked to see her without lawyers. Imani rejected the first request but accepted when Anika confirmed that the meeting could take place in a public coffee shop near the office. She arrived on time and found her husband sitting by the window. He had lost weight and was wearing an old suit, one of the first they bought when the company started to grow. On the table was a small box. Dominic said it contained the emerald bracelet that Aaliyah had worn in the library. He had retrieved it before she left the Miami condo. Imani did not open the box. She asked him why he wanted to return it now. He replied that because he should never have given it away. He then admitted that he had started giving Aaliyah objects from their marriage to convince her that the separation was inevitable. Each gift removed a part of Imani from the new life he was promising. Dominic assured her that he no longer had any relationship with Aaliyah. According to him, she had disappeared as soon as she understood there would be no yacht, unlimited accounts, or a position within the group. Imani reminded him that he had also emotionally abandoned their marriage when he thought he could get something more brilliant. She did not accept him presenting Aaliyah as the sole responsible party. Dominic looked down and admitted that he had enjoyed being admired. With Imani, he shared a history in which she knew his failures, his debts, and the doors he needed others to open. With Aaliyah, he could pretend he had always been a powerful man. The mistress did not remind him how much he owed his wife. Imani listened to this confession without interrupting. It was probably the most sincere thing he had said since the project began, but sincerity came too late. It could not erase the forged documents or the threats uttered when he still believed himself invincible. Dominic asked her to declare to the bank that the false meetings could have arisen from poor coordination. He did not ask her to withdraw the entire complaint, only to soften the intent to reduce the potential criminal consequences. In return, he offered to voluntarily cede a larger portion of his shares and renounce any claim on her father's building. Imani looked at him with disappointment. Even after acknowledging his mistakes, he was still trying to negotiate the truth. She explained that she could not change the facts to protect him. She never attended the meetings, never authorized the transfer, and did not provide her signature for those documents. Any different statement would be another falsehood, this time committed by both of them. Dominic replied that he could lose his freedom. Imani said she was sorry, but he had had many opportunities to stop. When he used the first signature, when he created the company, when she questioned him in the library, and when the bank showed up at the marina, on each occasion, he chose to move forward. Before leaving, Dominic pushed the bracelet box towards her. Imani returned it to the center of the table and said she didn't want it. The jewel no longer represented their anniversary, but the ease with which he had turned a memory into an instrument of humiliation. She asked him to sell it and use the money to pay for part of the expenses caused by the investigation. Dominic asked if she could ever forgive him. Imani replied that she was already working on it, but clarified that forgiving did not mean returning. She did not want to spend the rest of her life fueling hatred, because that would keep Dominic inside every future decision. However, she would not confuse the absence of resentment with a new opportunity. Some doors close not to punish the one left outside, but to protect the one who has finally learned to stay within herself. Imani stood up, paid for her coffee, and left without taking the box. The criminal investigation concluded that there was sufficient evidence of document forgery, breach of fiduciary duty, and attempted fraud against the financial institution. Dominic reached a plea deal with the prosecution after cooperating, returning funds, and acknowledging part of the facts. The sentence included a suspended prison term conditioned on fulfilling several obligations, a hefty fine, and a temporary ban on managing companies. He did not go to prison, but for years he lost the ability to lead the company he considered his greatest creation. Sean Dubois received sanctions for his involvement in the instrumental company, while Aaliyah avoided more serious charges by providing messages and testifying against both. For some, the consequences seemed insufficient. For others, the public, economic, and professional fall was already a huge punishment. Imani did not celebrate the resolution. She had learned that justice rarely returns exactly what was lost. No sentence could restore trust, but at least it prevented the lie from being recorded as a simple marital dispute. Vance Hospitality survived thanks to a profound restructuring. Imani agreed to temporarily chair the board on the condition of incorporating independent auditors, limiting the CEO's power, and requiring dual authorization for operations linked to family members. She also created an internal channel for employees to report irregularities without depending on the person being investigated. Brianna kept her job after cooperating, although she was transferred to another department and received legal support. Keisha was hired as a compliance manager in the maritime division that the company maintained through agreements with external operators, without acquiring new vessels. Imani did not seek to surround herself with people who would obey her, but with professionals willing to ask questions. During the first meeting under the new system, she declared that a company could not depend on the supposed genius of one man. Strong companies were not those where no one contradicted the leader, but those where no single person had enough power to hide their mistakes. The building in Cascade Heights was completely freed from the guarantee after the bank and the company agreed on the yacht's liquidation. Imani visited the property one morning and walked through the office that had belonged to her father. For years, she had rented it out without changing much of the decor. On a shelf, she found a family photograph taken before she met Dominic. In it, a young Imani appeared, holding some blueprints while her father looked at her with pride. She remembered that she had studied business and finance before scaling back her career to support her husband's projects. She was not a woman alien to the business world who had suddenly learned to defend herself. She had always possessed that knowledge. She simply allowed others to present it as irrelevant. She decided to reserve 2 floors of the building for a different project, something that would not bear the Vance name or serve to display wealth. She wanted to turn the averted loss into an opportunity for other women. Months later, she inaugurated the Horizon Bishop Foundation, dedicated to offering financial, legal, and professional training to women who wanted to work in the maritime, hospitality, and technology sectors. Many were single mothers, laid-off workers, or young women without industry contacts. The program did not offer luxuries or promise immediate transformations. It provided scholarships, mentoring, paid internships, and knowledge, so that no participant would sign contracts without understanding their risks. Imani explained during the inauguration that independence was not just about having money, but about knowing one's own voice in a negotiation. Teresa attended in a wheelchair and cut the inaugural ribbon. Anika took a discreet place in the audience, while Keisha presented the first course on port management. There was no champagne against any hull or names written in gold. Still, Imani felt that this was the first truly her own project in many years. Aaliyah left Atlanta and began working for a small communications agency in another city. For a time, she tried to sell exclusive interviews about her relationship with Dominic, but the offers dwindled when the media stopped considering her a central figure. In a letter that never quite became a full apology, she wrote to Imani that they had both been deceived by the same man. Imani did not reply. She knew that Dominic had lied to them both, but she also knew that Aaliyah was aware of the guarantee, had mocked the risk to the building, and had participated in the wife's exclusion. Being the victim of a lie did not eliminate the responsibility for the decisions made after knowing it. Imani did not need to humiliate her or watch her fall. Indifference proved to be a more definitive separation than any revenge. Aaliyah had wanted to occupy another woman's life through objects, spaces, and photographs. She ended up discovering that an identity built with someone else's belongings disappears when those belongings are no longer available. A year after the failed ceremony, Imani returned to Martha's Vineyard to introduce the first students of the foundation, who would begin internships at companies in the port. At the end of the event, she walked to the end of the dock where the yacht had been. The vessel was no longer there. A worker told her that the new owner had christened it with his mother's name and used it for family trips and marine research projects. Imani smiled at the irony that the same hull could acquire a completely different meaning under different decisions. The water held no signs of the security tape, the cameras, or the speeches. Only a few photographs could prove that the humiliation had occurred in that place. Imani understood that settings remained in memory for less time than the choices made within them. She could remember the marina without continuing to live emotionally in that midday moment. Anika met her by the dock and handed her the final divorce decree. The properties had been divided, the diverted funds returned as much as possible, and Dominic's shares reduced to cover his responsibilities. Imani kept the building, the villa, and a sufficient stake to protect the group's new structure. Dominic would keep some assets and could rebuild his life after complying with the imposed restrictions. There were no absolute winners. The end of a marriage of so many years always left spaces that no resolution could order. Imani signed the receipt of the document and looked at her name. Imani Bishop, without the Vance added at social events. She did not feel lonelier, but more recognizable. She had spent years being introduced as the businessman's wife. Now her identity did not need a relationship to be explained. Anika asked her what she wanted to do next. Imani replied that she wanted to have lunch with the students and listen to their plans. Before leaving the marina, Imani received a message from Dominic. It was brief and contained no requests. He informed her that he had started working as a consultant for a small company, under supervision and without administrative functions. He also said that he finally understood that she had not taken the company from him, but had prevented him from destroying it. Imani read the message and put her phone away. She didn't know if Dominic had truly changed, nor did she need to check. His transformation was no longer a condition for her peace. For a long time, she believed that closing a story required understanding all of the other person's reasons. Now she knew that some explanations came too late, and that it was still possible to keep walking. She looked at the empty space at the mooring and remembered the golden letters that had seemed enormous. Aaliyah's name had disappeared. The debt was settled. The woman relegated to the third row now directed her own life. That afternoon, the foundation students boarded a training vessel much smaller than the old yacht. There were no marble lounges or custom cabins, but each wore a uniform with her own name embroidered on it. Imani watched them learn to check the moorings, read instruments, and distribute responsibilities. A young woman named Carmen confessed that she had never been on a boat and was afraid of making a mistake in front of everyone. Imani replied that courage was not about not feeling fear, but about refusing to hand over the helm of one's own life for fear of asking questions. Carmen nodded and returned to the exercise. As the vessel slowly moved away from the dock, Imani felt an emotion that no luxury party had ever given her. Her father's legacy was not financing a lie. It was opening paths for people who might never have had access to that world. Imani then understood that dignity was not measured by the size of a house, the value of a jewel, or the name painted on a hull. Dignity appeared when a person refused to cooperate with her own humiliation, even if telling the truth meant losing a known life. Dominic had believed that money could buy silence, loyalty, and admiration. Aaliyah had believed that occupying Imani's objects was equivalent to taking her place. Both discovered that power built on others' resources disappears as soon as the person holding the structure up withdraws their consent. Imani hadn't won because the bank canceled a christening. She had won when she stopped asking for permission to protect herself. The truth might be slow to reach the stage, but once documented, no music, speech, or golden name could force it to remain hidden.